Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Courtney Aguirre, and I work as the Performance Strategy Program Manager and Equity Work Group Co-Lead for SCAG. I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting along with my colleague, Anika Van Isle. We want to thank you for joining us for today's Toolbox Tuesday training session that's going to be focused on equity action plans and frameworks. We do want to start off by saying that we hope that you're all staying safe and healthy. And as I had noted at the outset, for those of you who had already joined us, we would encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat if you're able, so that we know who's with us. And we know that the feature is functioning well for you, since we hope that you'll be logging your questions throughout today's session using the chat feature. So on the slide before you, you can see a handful of meeting logistics items. This meeting is anticipated to take about, sorry, see that advanced. You know, it's curious, I wasn't advancing the slides, but they were moving. Okay, so sorry about that. That's new for me. So as I was saying, the training should take about an hour and a half. All of our participant lines are currently muted. We are aiming to provide ASL interpretation today, provided by Hilda Estrada. I'm hoping that they'll be joining us fairly soon. In the meantime, though, as was hopefully noted for you in the chat, we do have closed captioning for you. You can also deactivate that if you find it distracting. As I think I was trying to describe to you, we are going to take questions as you have them in the chat. We'll log them and share them during the Q&A after each presentation. If you do find that you have questions later, we can connect you with our presenters. And you can reach out to them directly or to us, just so that hopefully you can get the responses that you need. We're going to be recording today's meeting so that we can post it on our Toolbox Tuesday website, where you can review all the past trainings that we've had. If you're curious, we've hosted a handful now on equity-related topics, and you can also see a forecast of upcoming trainings that we're aiming to offer. We'll share a website link in the chat. If it's not been posted, we will be posting that for your use. So since last year, we have been trying very, very hard to offer equity-focused Toolbox Tuesday trainings. We are curious to hear what you might want to see in terms of additional trainings. We'll be polling you in just a bit. But before we get there, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. There we go. So as staff at SCAG, I want to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh. And as we acknowledge we're on the original lands of these peoples and how deeply the field of urban planning continues to engage with the land, we want to offer this acknowledgement as a first step to hopefully more conversations, more actions that will support Indigenous communities in thriving. Some additional resources for learning more are hopefully being shared in the chat as well. So you can take this information and hopefully learn more about where you are and what lands you're on. Now on the slide before you, you're going to see the agenda for today. We are very, very fortunate to have a really solid group of folks joining us today. We're all very, very excited on SCAG's end about this. We have the Government Alliance on Race and Equity with us, who's going to be highlighting their how-to manual on equity action plans. SCAG actually consulted this resource quite a bit as we worked on our action plan last year. We're also going to be hearing from a couple of local jurisdictions on how they went about developing their own action plans. We're going to be hearing from Long Beach, a city in our region, as well as Portland, where they have also been doing some very significant work on advancing equity. We'll drop a couple of links in the chat now for you, just so that you can later look at SCAG's racial equity early action plan if you're curious, and you can check out our website where we are trying to post more on our progress so that more folks can, understand what we're up to and hopefully join the effort, right, to advance equity across our region. And so if you want to understand what today's objectives are, they're on the slide before you. We're really hoping that you're going to, at the end of today's session, understand what the purpose of an equity action plan is, how it can fit into your larger effort to advance equity in your community. We want to also share what common components are included in an equity action plan and different approaches, right, for developing one. And hopefully hopefully today's session is going to provide you with, again, the resources and the knowledge on how to go about developing an equity action plan that can meet the needs of your agency or your organization. And so with that, I think we're going to get going with our polls. So we have a handful of questions for you. The first, we're just trying to get a sense of what type of community, jurisdiction, or geography are you representing? Are you in, don't know if I can launch the poll myself. Our audiovisual support today, I should note, is provided by Jennifer, who's fantastic. And so hopefully now you see the poll before you. We're just trying to get a sense of who the audience for today's session is. That might help us as we, respond to your questions and share additional content. So thank you for responding to that question. The other question we have for you is, does your organization have resources dedicated directly to equity work? We know that it can sometimes be a challenge for agencies to find the resources, to help support this work. And so we, are hoping we can offer some support to you in the future. And so it'd be great to understand, again, what resources you do have right now. And the final question is, has your agency developed an equity action plan? Kind of a core question, I think, for today's session is understanding, have you developed one? Are you in the process of developing one? And so I do see quite a few folks have responded. Thank you for that. And I think we're going to give it maybe a handful more seconds just to make sure anyone who's wanted to participate can offer their responses, and then we'll end it and share the results with you all. So thank you for responding and indulging us in this. Okay, so I think we're pretty much fixed. So I'm going to share the results with the group. Hopefully you can see that. So in response to that first question of what community, jurisdiction, and geography are you representing, I see that most of you are reporting that you're from a city. The next chunk from county type of agency or organization, and then the final, not the final, but the two that are split at 19% community and a regional organization. So we've got quite a few cities, quite a few counties, and then regional and community organizations, and not any federal organizations, and just one representative from the state. Thank you. And so the next question we have, does your organization have resources dedicated directly to equity work? Taking a look at that, I see that quite a significant chunk, about almost 40%, say that you do have some resources, but you're severely limited by funding or staff. And some of you do have dedicated funding or staff. So it seems as though, a good chunk, what is that, 40 plus 70% roughly, have some type of resources, which is, reassuring and good to hear. But it sounds like there could be more support for you that would be helpful. And the final question, has your agency developed an equity action plan? Perhaps the most relevant question for today's session. I'm seeing that a good chunk of you don't know, actually, if you have developed one, but another 40% are saying that you have developed one or you are in the process of developing one. So that's good to hear as well. So hopefully, again, regardless of where you are in your process, again, this will be helpful for you. So I think we can close out of that. Okay. And so now what I'd like to do is move on towards introducing our first presenter, Leslie Zeitler, who works for the Government Alliance on Race and Equity's California branch and functions and works as their regional manager. In this role, Leslie has provided training, capacity building, and technical assistance to city, county, regional, and state agencies across California that are integrating a racial equity analysis into the work of their agencies. So Leslie is going to be sharing some highlights from GEAR's Racial Equity Action Plan How-To Manual. And as I mentioned, SCAG found this an enormously helpful resource, and we hope that you will as well. And so I want to welcome Leslie, and hopefully we can share your slides and get going. Thank you. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. I am psyched to see the people that we have in the room. And I will say my prior position was the GARE California Regional Manager for several years. And as a result of our strategic planning process, some of you are aware of the strategic planning process we've been in. I'll be stepping into a new role, and we're actually moving out of the regional manager roles because we're serving more of a national footprint. And there will be more information to come after the annual membership meeting and also during the annual membership meeting next week. So my new role will be the Director of GARE Learning Strategies, or the Director of Learning Strategies at GARE. And so I'm incoming into that position. So thank you for that. We're going to do a really brief high-level overview of racial equity action planning, and there's some contextual pieces for this. Because I can't assume that everybody in the room has the same understanding or context for why we're talking about this. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about contextual pieces and why racial equity work is important in government and some of the shared language that we'll need to have. And then after that, I'll talk about racial equity action planning. Again, at a very high level, we often do this, it's at least a half day to a full day of training. And you'll probably get a lot out of the examples that you've got from the other two agencies that'll be presenting here this afternoon. So if you can go to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, and the Atlantic acknowledgement was already done. Thank you, from Courtney, so you can go past that one. Okay, so our objectives for this afternoon is to identify content that informs the use of racial equity analysis in government work. That's sort of the history and shared language pieces. Identify whose needs and voices are centered in racial equity work and why. And then to identify the relationship between the use of the racial equity toolkit and those steps and the necessary components of racial equity action plans. You can go to the next slide. So here, one of the things I wanted to hold is that this is still a learning environment, and that there are two agencies who will be presenting after me. And so these are typically the learning agreements that we use in our learning spaces. And so I would ask for people to just review them really briefly. And then if you can, put a thumbs up on your screen, or, whether it's your physical thumb or the reactions that you can click on after you've reviewed it. And the agreement is to hold these agreements for our learning environment through the other two presentations as well. So the take space, make space, just noticing, when you might choose to speak or when you might choose to step back. Confidentiality is to maintain confidentiality. What is said here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. You can take learnings, don't share the names. Brave space, it can often be really uncomfortable talking about race and racism because we've been socialized to not talk about it. And yet, if we can't talk about it, we can't solve for it. So we encourage people to consider stepping into what we would consider brave space. Offer what you can, ask for what you need is self-explanatory. One mic, one speaker at a time, also self-explanatory. Accept and expect a lack of closure. It took us 400, 500 years to get to this point. And there's some things that are not going to turn around in just 2 or 3 years. Some things may take longer, so we may not have closure right now. We encourage you to use I statements. Can everybody agree to that? Thumbs up on your screens, reactions, or in the, in the reactions button. Okay, thank you, Courtney. Am I seeing others? I'm going to just say, for the sake of time, I'm going to assume that everybody who is in this space together, and as this is recording, that you consent to this learning environment, these sets of agreements, by continuing to participate in this session. You go to the next slide. I also am going to roll through this pretty quickly. Okay, and one of the things that Courtney and Anita had asked me to make sure to cover is, for GARE member jurisdictions, what's some of the programming and connection spaces that people can find. So there have been Q&A office hours. There's GARE 365 webinars, which is basically bringing learning from both in and outside government that can be of use to our GARE members. That's monthly. Same thing for membership connections. Those are also monthly. And we strive to provide content you'll find helpful to your work. And so an example might be geospatial mapping and how that could be used in racial equity work. There will be networking groups as well. We have our GARE member portal. There's a secure section of the GARE member portal, which has a lot of resources and connection places with other people across the nation. And then we have our annual membership meeting. That is actually next week for 2022. If you've already registered, we're so excited to see you virtually or in person. Registration is closed, so if you can't make it this year, we encourage you to come in future years as GARE members, and it's specific to GARE members. There's a lot of programming available and presentations from your colleagues across jurisdictions across the nation. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so here's the contextual piece that we need to have shared language and shared understanding about. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so some of you are familiar with this content. I'm going to go through it really briefly. Part of the reason that we include this information is people often don't have a context for understanding the role of government in contributing to policies and practices and procedures that result and are connected to institutional and structural racism. So when our government was initially formed, it was okay to have explicit policies and practices and procedures that was about creating and maintaining racial inequities. We did come to an understanding that this now has become implicit. The phase that was was making discrimination outright, that was illegal. However, race neutral policies and practices perpetuated inequities. And so now we find ourselves in this third stage, governing for racial equity, where we're looking at our policies, practices, and procedures and asking, how do we advance racial equity now? Because there's some structural issues that affect people differentially. Now, this is a very high level overview of the slide. There's a lot more information that we typically share in this slide, but this is sort of like, generally speaking, this is why we find ourselves having this conversation. And what is our responsibility in government if government initially was involved in establishing policies, practices, and procedures that put these, that resulted in racial inequities? And so what is our responsibility now as government employees to make changes for racial equity? You go to the next slide. Okay, why we lead with race. And so, again, I'm going to just acknowledge that we've been socialized not to talk about race and racism. It can be very uncomfortable because it's considered one of those taboo subjects. And if we can't talk about it, we can't solve for it. We have racial inequities that are deep and pervasive. And you think about any measure of success like educational outcomes, health outcomes, involvement with criminal justice, housing. Significant disparities in outcomes based on race have remained deep and pervasive. This learning and institutional and structural approach can be used with other areas of marginalization too, the type of analysis that we're getting to. And specificity matters. So if we misdiagnose the problem, so if we say, well, we're just going to talk about equity in general, but we're not explicit about race, or we're not explicit about, for example, gender or disabilities or what have you, we're never going to be able to solve this, right? It's uncomfortable, yes, for some people. And it's like using a new muscle or using a muscle you haven't used in a long time. It's going to be uncomfortable at first, and then you start to get a groove in how you're being able to talk about this and applying a racial equity analysis. And so we say that even when we control for factors such as gender, orientation, sexual orientation, disability, race is still the top predictor of outcomes. And so specific problems require specific and targeted solutions. It's also important to note that we're race explicit, not exclusive. We always bring an intersectional analysis to the conversation and would challenge you all to do the same. And it's important because we know that there's no separating our identities. I can't separate my racial identity from my gender, and etc. So we know that the lines of our identity weave together to form tapestries of the human beings that we are. And identity is complex because the different combinations who we are can bring us either closer or farther away from power. So can you go to the next slide? Okay, so what do we actually mean by racial equity? So what is the goal? We're talking about closing gaps so that race is not a predictor of one's success and simultaneously improving outcomes for everyone. And that means we have to target strategies to focus improvements for those who are worse off, Some of you may be familiar with John Powell's work on targeted universalism. I encourage you to check that out. And we need to move beyond services and focus on changing policies, institutions, and structures, okay? So if you think we have to change these programs, you're addressing symptoms. If you're looking at changing policies, institutions, and structures, you're looking at addressing root causes. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. All right, so these are some definitions. This is important to have shared definitions about what we're talking about: individual racism, institutional racism, structural racism. Individual racism is bigotry or discrimination by an individual based on race. And what we're talking about is institutional and structural racism in terms of changing policies, practices, and procedures. So institutional racism is looking at the policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. Structural racism is the history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions, combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. You go to the next slide. Great. And some of you are very familiar with this who have worked with GARE. This is our approach. Normalize, operationalize, organize, and visualize. Normalize is having a shared analysis and definitions, part of what I just went through now, so we know what we're all talking about, and having a sense of urgency and prioritization for this work. Because while it took 400 or 500 years to get here, we don't have that time right now to come out of it, because people are continuing to be negatively impacted in present day. Organize, that's not just talking about community-based organizations and community members organizing. This is about how we're organizing our personnel in our departments, across our departments, and also in partnership between our departments and people who've been most negatively impacted by structural racism. Operationalize, that's looking at the tools that we use and disaggregating our data, looking at our data and disaggregating it by gender, race, and geography. Visualize is thinking, what would it look like to be in a world where racial equity is the norm? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so racial equity action planning. Can you go to the next slide? So there's some benefits to this. Part of it is the approach is enterprise-wide for racial equity action plan, so that you understand, like, there's some coordination efforts that need to take place. This is part of making institutional change happen. We're all working toward a shared vision. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Go back one. Go forward one. I know it, yeah, there you go. So want to be clear that the documentation for a racial equity action plan comes from having used the racial equity tool, application of the racial equity tool first. So if there's anything, if I were to give you a little like quiz at the end of this time together, one of the questions I'd say is, what actually needs to happen before you put into a racial equity action plan into place? The resounding answer I should get from every single one of you is that we have used the racial equity tool, we have applied it, and the projects that we are looking at inform and are plugged into the racial equity action plan. Okay, so that's a key piece of this, and it allows you to do several things. You communicate your findings in report style, you state what you're going to do, you highlight the resources that you need. It's a planning document to support you to do this enterprise-wide. Okay, next slide, please. So there's accountability in this, because you want to know what's the timeline for a given project, who are the point people. I will say, if you don't have a name in addition to a department on your racial equity action plan, you are going to be hurting yourselves, because then you'll be like, wait, who's supposed to do that? This is about how we hold ourselves accountable, because this is not just about how I'm holding somebody else accountable, it's also how I'm holding myself. How are we holding ourselves accountable in this work? We also will share this racial equity action plan on our public site. We also include evaluation pieces in this, because we'll have to have reports on indicators and involve the public and invite them in tracking our results. Next slide, please. So this is just to say, remember what I said if I had a quiz at the end of this session, and what would be the thing I would ask you is, what do you do before you implement a racial equity action plan? You do the racial equity tool, an application of it. And go to the next slide. So these are the steps, and they're not unlike the steps that are general for racial equity action planning, which is why I want to just cover these briefly here. You have desired results, which go at the top of your racial equity action plan. It's also part of your racial equity toolkit methodology. You analyze your data on your racial equity action plan. That's your community level indicators, right? And then community engagement. And our goal is to shift power to those who've been most negatively impacted. And you should be engaging communities. It might be the third step here on this slide, but you should be doing it consistently. It shouldn't be a one-time thing. Now, part of this, the strategies for racial equity, comes from doing a root cause analysis. That's the other thing I would say if your second takeaway from this time together. If you take away that you must always do a root cause analysis before you get to strategies and solutions, I will send you gold stars. I will say, Courtney, Anita, send me send me the names, or I'll send them the stickers to forward it to you. Always do a root cause analysis, because if you don't, then you'll get the same results that you got before, because you're only attending to symptoms. Okay. You'll have your implementation plan, which we're talking about racial equity action planning, and communication and accountability, which also is about formulating messages for working with staff, for working with the public, and documenting how you're accountable. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a reminder that we're looking for solutions that work for those most vulnerable in our communities. And when we do that, we find solutions that work better for everyone. You can think about curb cuts and the design of sidewalks in order to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The thing is, curb cuts don't just help people living with disabilities. There's a whole range of people who, like people who are parents, and there are strollers, right? There are people who have luggage who are traveling. There are people who are riding bicycles on some of the sidewalks, and it helps them not get jarred, or like pulling some kind of cart for some reason with their groceries. So there's a whole range of reasons why we say, look for solutions that work for most vulnerable in our communities, and you typically benefit everybody else. Okay, next slide. So here's a reminder, after you apply the racial equity toolkit, then you step into racial equity action planning. So here's the high level, here we go. Go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so this is a brief review. Basically, there are 5 general steps. There's the preparation, and there's several sub-steps in preparation. There's research and information gathering. There are findings, you develop your plan, and then there's implementation, reporting, and evaluation. Next. Okay, at the heart of this, you want to ask yourselves, are we engaging in transactional or transformational change by doing these processes? So transactional approaches are issue-based efforts that help individuals negotiate existing structures. The analysis is that individuals not adequately handling a properly functioning structure, whereas the structure may be insensitive at best and hostile at worst to the varying circumstances of people's lives. These solutions transact with institutions to get a short-term gain that may have long-term unintended consequences for communities that leave the existing structure in place. Our goal is transformative approaches that are based on policy and practice initiatives, okay, which cross multiple institutions and organizations to shift societal structures towards proactive solutions. Now, when I say transformative approaches, if you're working in a silo, this is the reminder. Here's the third takeaway: working across departments, working with communities. See how my hand is here? This is how we want to work. We don't want to be in silos. We want to work together. All right, that's the third takeaway. So your racial equity action plans are intended to be transformative, enterprise-wide guiding documents for institutional and organizational change work. Next. So these are some examples of transactional approaches and transformative approaches. And so I'm not going to go in depth to those. What I do want to say is you can have some transactional approaches add up to equal a transformative approach. The goal is always going to be transformative approaches. Next slide. Yeah, and there's some examples there which Courtney and Anita can share the slides later. We're going to skip over that. Okay, root cause analysis is a key piece of the preparation. You want to know what the root causes are. There's ways to engage in that. The example used here is maternal infant mortality rates. You would dig down and say, why are we seeing the data that we're seeing disaggregated by race, gender, and geography, for example, with maternal and infant mortality rates? And you'll keep digging down and asking why, probably 5 to 7 times. So I won't go into that now, but you want root cause analysis in whatever you do. Next. Partnerships are a key piece. If you're not engaging with community members who've been most negatively impacted, it's not a racial equity action plan. I'm going to say that again. If you are not engaging with community members who have been most negatively impacted by racial inequities, it's not a racial equity action plan. So it's key. This is a key facet of the work that you'll need to do. Next slide. This is another diagram for thinking about shifting power to communities who've been most negatively impacted. It's shifting power for racial justice is the goal. Next slide. And these are some thoughts about engaging with communities and some of the work that's needed, including being clear about your intended outcomes and also thinking about what are the roles and who can be involved in these major decision points and how can they be involved? How will you be communicating, considering compensation? They are experts on their lived experience, so why are we not compensating them the way we would other consultants? Next slide. Okay, this is step 2, it's research and information gathering. You've got a number of steps here, but it's basically looking at your data and synthesizing the results. And there are a variety of ways to do that. Next slide. Then you'll have findings based on your data gathering. So you might look internally at your workforce demographics, your hiring, retention, and promotion. You might look at your contracting practices and procurement practices. You might be looking at skills and capacity of leadership and staff. So that might be training and capacity building, looking at community access and partnerships, and then thinking about your programs, the data metrics, and ongoing focus on improvements. So there's a number of ways to look at your findings and really to sit with all of those aspects. Next slide. Then you've got a plan to develop, and there are key measurement principles. You've got your results, desired results. What do you hope to see in the community? What does your data say at the community level, which are your community level indicators? Then you've got outcomes. What do you aim to achieve with an action at the department or organization level? And what does your data say at the organization level? Those will be your performance measures. Go ahead, next. And so here's some definitions about what's a desired result, what are community indicators, what are performance measures. You'll have that moving forward. So I'm just going to say, go ahead to the next slide, because I know we're running low on time. Your performance measures should address, and this is based on results-based accountability for racial equity, should address how much will we do, how well can we do it, will anyone be better off? Again, after this presentation, you can take a look at this. The one that I want to call out is circumstances changed on will anyone be better off? If the work that you're doing does not change circumstances so that we don't see continued racial inequities, then you've got to go back and think about what you're doing, address root causes, and involve community members most negatively impacted on the root cause analysis and planning for strategies and solutions. Next slide. So your racial equity action plan, please go to the next slide, is step 5. There are components to your action plans. You go to the next one. Yeah, so you'll have, and we recommend the use of a spreadsheet, or, people do it in different ways. You could do it in Miro, you could do it in Excel. There are a variety of ways, but you want to make sure you've got your desired result statement, your community level indicators, the strategies, organizational outcomes and actions, and associated root causes. For all of them, your timelines, your accountability, for example, the names of people who will be the follow-up on a given project, performance measures, and progress reports. Next slide. And then this is your implementation planning checklist, because overall, is this realistic? Do you have adequate funding? Do you have adequate staffing? Do you have resources to ensure ongoing data collection? Do you need to put that in place? These are good questions to ask. You can also come back to this at the end of the presentation once Courtney and Anita share it. Can you go to next slide? Okay, and just this is a last like thought-provoking thing, if you can go to the next slide, about competencies for racial equity analysis, planning, and implementation. It's about thinking about what kind of knowledge and skills will you need to have if you want to engage with this work and to continue to grow. This is something that is not a one and done. I will say I am on my own journey. I will never be done. I encourage you all to step into it if you haven't already, with the perspective that none of us is really going to be done because of the way we've been socialized and because of the systems that are in place. So I encourage you to check out these competencies after the presentation, and then you may have further questions about that. And go ahead into the, I think it's where the closing slide. Yes. So I just want to say thank you, everyone. And I'm excited to hear from the other presenters.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was a lot to take in, but enormously helpful. I mean, I know you said you usually spend what, a half day or a full day walking people through how to develop an equity action plan. I hope folks on the line found that helpful as well. As I said, SCAG consulted that resource, the how-to manual, quite a bit as we were developing our action plan. I haven't seen questions pop up in the chat, but I know Annalie's monitoring. But if you do have questions in the chat, because we're a bit behind, I'm hoping Leslie can respond directly in the chat, and maybe we can have a larger Q&A at the end. Again, just wanting to, hopefully keep a flow a bit. But thank you, Leslie. The work, as I said, from Garrett is completely foundational, I think, for government agencies as they move on advancing equity. So now I'd like to introduce our next presenters from the City of Long Beach. Teresa Chandler joined the City of Long Beach in 2015 as the Homeless Services Officer and currently serves as a Deputy City Manager, providing leadership to a number of efforts focused on improving health and safety for all people in Long Beach. In this role, she oversees the work of the Office of Equity. She is joined today by her colleague. Alana Grant is Long Beach's new equity officer. Alana leads the equity team in developing and implementing innovative strategies that dismantle inequities and systemic barriers in policies and programs so that everyone can hopefully reach their highest potential. Welcome, Teresa and Alana, and I'll let you take it off with the presentation.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you for the introduction. It's really exciting to be here with all of you today, and it is even more exciting to follow Leslie's presentation because I'll talk about a little bit further in our presentation, but GARE really helped us set our foundation. We've had cohorts go through GARE, and you'll see a lot of similarities, I think, in the presentation as we move forward. So again, I'm Teresa Chandler, a Deputy City Manager. I've been with the City of Long Beach for about 7 years. And the last 2 years I've spent in the city manager's office, being able to do this work with an amazing team and across our departments as well. And then Alana Grant is joining me as our new equity officer. And she's been with the city for quite a bit of time in different capacities, but with the Office of Equity for a little bit over a year. So we're just really excited to be here. And so we'll move on to our presentation with you. So I think Alana is going to be advancing for me. There we go. All right, so together today, we're going to provide an overview of the Long Beach Office of Equity. That's who we are and what we do. We are also going to share some background on the Framework for Reconciliation, which was a community participatory process, which culminated into the Long Beach Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative that was adopted almost 2 years ago. So as we discuss reconciliation, we will provide a high level of updates on our first year of implementation, including our staffing infrastructure, accomplishments, and ongoing efforts, and then talk about some promising practices and challenges that we have encountered and that are definitely informing how we proceed into our priorities for year 2. And then finally, we're going to introduce the results-based accountability framework our team is using to develop our departmental racial equity action plans that are informed by the potential actions outlined in reconciliation. So a lot of work happening across all of our city departments here in Long Beach. All right, so the Office of Equity was actually established back in 2017 following a council direction to align programs from other departments such as language access, violence prevention, and the Human Relations Commission. And this was all aligned under our Department of Health and Human Services. So the Office of Equity actually moved to the city manager's office in October of 2020 to ensure that we as a city reach across all of our departments. So not just coming out of the health department, but that we touch all 21, and then we do have some elected offices as well. And so as such, the Long Beach Office of Equity educates and supports our city staff and elected officials to advance equity and to ensure that all Long Beach residents have what we need to thrive. So we do this by engaging community voices to inform and design a policy and systems change, making inequities visible using data and storytelling, and then also building our city's capacity to advance equity through training, tools, and technical assistance. So it was really, again, really nice to hear from Leslie. And our city was actually able to create a solid foundation for this reconciliation work because of the work we did with GARE. So we actually had 3 cohorts that went through from a variety of our city departments. And so when our city council called on us to move into this reconciliation work, 2 years ago, we actually had a pretty solid foundation in order to proceed. And a lot of those leaders that went through the cohorts were the ones who stepped up and were able to join us in the reconciliation effort. So it really has been a journey of action planning. And, you know, it's been a journey. So we'll talk more about that as we go. So the framework for reconciliation. So following the murder of George Floyd almost 2 years ago now, the Long Beach City Council declared racism as a public health crisis and engaged in a really earnest conversation about the need to restore public trust in government and reconcile the gap in experiences of impacted and vulnerable people with current city policies, especially the Black community. So this was a call to action for all of our city departments. As the City Council called on us to prepare the framework for reconciliation initial report, they asked us to walk through these 4 steps. So the first step is acknowledging the existence and longstanding impacts of systemic racism in Long Beach and across the country. And it wasn't just a step, but acknowledgement is an ongoing process for us throughout this journey. Listening to accounts and experiences of racial injustice, inequity, or harm to community members, and convening stakeholders to analyze feedback from the listening sessions and racial disparity data to recommend initiatives that shape policy, budgetary, charter, and programmatic reform. And now we're currently in this catalyzing phase, which is taking action, which includes immediate short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations that council approved in order for us to move forward. So ultimately, our vision is that race and ethnicity do not determine social and economic outcomes for those who live and work in Long Beach. And to achieve this, we must actively engage in ongoing initiatives to dismantle and eliminate systemic racism. So the framework for reconciliation centered community voices in a participatory process, as I mentioned before, which culminated into the 4 goals on the screen that you see here. Each goal has anywhere from 3 to 8 strategies. And following the council's adoption of the initial report on August 11th, 2020, it was a very clear night for me, we walked away with nearly 120 potential actions. So keeping in mind, we went through this reconciliation phase in a very, very short amount of time in order to align with our city's budget process for that year. And so we started in May, and then we went to council for approval on August 11th. So in an ideal amount of time would have been no less than 6 months, but we did do this entire process in about 2 months. So a lot of the goals and objectives were left very broad so that we could work with them as we move forward through the process. So I'm going to pass it on to Alana.
Thanks, Teresa. So we recently presented a late 1-year update on the initiative to the Long Beach City Council and community back in February. And in that update, we highlighted our staffing infrastructure, some of the most prominent updates related to the report, and the potential actions outlined within the initial report. And for today's study session, we are going to speak to how we've implemented things over the last year. So this slide demonstrates how the Office of Equity organized city staff across the entire organization to add capacity to our small but mighty team. As you can see, the Office of Equity sits at the center of this diagram, serving as the connector or synergy point that interweaves equity work across the city. I'll just pull out a few of some of our supporting bodies just for the sake of this conversation. So in our first year, we rebranded the Racial Equity Advisory Group and renamed them the Racial Equity Executive Team. We did this because we wanted the name to be reflective of our intentions for convening the department heads of the city. The executive team now plays an active role in learning and implementing equity frameworks within their department. And then among our implementation team, I just want to highlight a few of those work groups, such as the Internal Transformation Work Group. This body is made up of department champions who conduct department assessments, provide racial equity trainings, and lead the development of their department's racial equity action plans, which we'll get into later. And we have roughly 1 to 2 champions representing each department. The Data and Performance Metrics Work Group helps us develop data tools to promote equitable decision-making and design benchmarks for tracking our progress. And then our policy work group recently shifted its focus from legislation to really looking at the internal policies of the city organization. So there's been a huge interest and push to focus on workforce and workplace equity. And so as such, we are exploring the feasibility of making recommendations to the city's personnel, policies, procedures from within the civil service and human resources departments with additional support from our city attorney. And so just naming those, you'll hear more about kind of how these different bodies have been involved in our racial equity action planning and how some of these themes have been consistent throughout our first year of implementation. All right. So our 1-year report ended up being just as long as the initial report. And that's because we have so many actions to address to ensure that equity has a citywide reach across all of the city departments. We use the format on the screen to provide status updates on each of the immediate and short-term potential actions outlined within the initial report. And at the time that we presented to City Council in February, we reported that as a team, we had begun implementation of 93 immediate and short-term potential actions and had completed 12 of the actions uplifted within the Racial Equity and Reconciliation initial report.
All right, I'm going to run through our 4 goals very quickly and just give some high level accomplishments. There's a lot of work happening under each of the goals. But our first goal is ending systemic racism in Long Beach and all local government and partner agencies through internal transformation. So in this goal, we acknowledge that government has long been the creator and perpetrator of racist policies and practices, and it is our role and responsibility to proactively dismantle systemic racism. So following the adoption of the initial report, City Council directed the city manager to work with Human Relations Commission to update and expand its mission and scope to align with the recommendations from the initial report. The Equity and Human Relations Commission, they renamed, their purpose, functions, and memberships are modified with stakeholder input and approved by the City Council last fall. So additionally, our purchasing team is working to transform the city's procurement processes to remove barriers for Black and other historically marginalized business communities by streamlining processes and policies, developing resources for internal and external stakeholders, and improving our outreach. And I'll go into further depth about the capacity building tools we are using to normalize and operationalize equity across the organization in the next slide. So following the Government Alliance for Race Equity's theory of change, we first began with normalizing conversations about race within the city organization. We do this to establish shared language and grounding for our work, as Leslie spoke about so eloquently. It is pretty amazing how we have been able to incorporate this language into our common day conversations over the last couple of years. There's a lot of language that we were not able to use before or were looked down upon if we used it in certain spaces. And now we're talking the same language across our city departments. So that's pretty progressive for us. The internal transformation work group consists of 1 to 2 champions from every citywide department. So every department has committed champions. Champions facilitate Racial Equity 101 trainings and are actively involved in the Results-Based Accountability training series. We have a total of 41 champions at this time, and some departments going into year 2 have rotated out champions, but that's okay because more people are being trained to do this work, which is we want them to take that wherever they go within the organization and outside of the organization. So over the last year, they completed 32 hours of capacity building workshops and have trained over 1,000 city employees. Currently, 7 departments have fully trained their entire staff and more are on the horizon. This word cloud on this slide comes from the champions' responses to our year 2 survey. When asked what 3 words they would use to describe being a champion, they explained it as challenging, emotional, and important. Those were among the top. So these words underscore how impactful but hard this work truly is. So we're really working on putting things in place to support that internal transformation and our champions as they walk through this process as well. So goal 2 is designing and investing in community safety and violence prevention. So this focuses on moving upstream to address the root causes of violence and continue to expand on community safety efforts from a holistic place that includes a spectrum of city departments and a cross-sector collaboration efforts. This goal also focuses on building a coordinated reentry network, as well as a structural city investment in best practice and what works for community-based violence prevention and reentry. So a few of the updates that we'd like to highlight here include the health department filling staff positions related to community safety and youth development. $50,000 of reconciliation funding was allocated for the Long Beach Advancing Peace Steering Committee in 4 place-based areas across the city with the highest need. Long Beach Recovery Act funding allocated to expand the violence interrupter model from Central Long Beach into North Long Beach. Staff conducted a landscape analysis of the reentry service network in Long Beach and drafted a report with recommendations to pilot a reentry integrated model. And the police department is working with human resources, civil service, and labor organizations to develop the roles and responsibilities of the community services assistants, called CSAs, which will be unarmed civilians trained to respond to nonviolent crimes. Goal 3 is redesigning the police approach to community safety. So this comes directly from the Long Beach community, calling for the reimagining of police practices and assurances that none would disproportionately and negatively impact the Black community and communities of color. And so it takes a deeper dive into redesigning the police approach to community safety. So we'd like to highlight here the REACH team, which serves as an alternate response model focused on increasing access to services for people experiencing homelessness. Also a staff-led work group focusing on an alternative crisis response. So this objective garnered a support from City Council with the Recovery Act funding to pilot an alternative response program. So that is across, not just for people experiencing homelessness, but across the spectrum. So over the last year, this work group has developed recommendations for a non-police civilian crisis response team to respond to nonviolent, non-medical, non-criminal calls for service related to mental health crisis with technical assistance from Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab. We just conducted a stakeholder engagement with community members and service providers, and we are continuing to build out the scope of this pilot program, hoping to start that pilot in the summer or end of summer, early fall. The police department is developing a course catalog of trainings and professional development for officers to include topics related to procedural justice and racial equity. And lastly, the Technology and Innovation Commission has led discussions on regulatory approaches for the city's use of facial recognition technology and is prepared to transmit recommendations to the Long Beach City Council. And finally, goal 4. So this is everything else, everything but the kitchen sink is what we usually say. This is our most extensive, as it lists potential actions to improve health and wellness in the city by eliminating social and economic disparities in the communities most impacted by racism. We know that if we want to improve health and safety for all, we must look at the root at what creates opportunity. Things like economic justice, early child and youth development, housing, environmental justice, and the list goes on. So a few things to highlight here is some structural funding added to the health department's budget to implement the Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative, a significant amount of recovery funding to invest in health equity and economic equity. The Parks, Rec, and Marine Strategic Plan acknowledges that park equity, access to green and open space is directly linked to life outcomes. Therefore, recovery funding has been allocated to invest in health equity and economic equity through programs such as food security, youth programming, digital inclusion, early childhood education, business support, and housing. So passing it on to Alana to talk about results-based accountability.
So as you can see, reconciliation is a huge undertaking. It requires the coordination and participation of all city staff. And we have this very expansive list of potential actions that concern hiring, data collection, our transparency of data, the spectrum of public safety, and all of the social determinants of health. All of these strategies came from the voices of the Long Beach community and was centered on the voices of people of color. And as we implement these racial equity strategies, our ability to measure and evaluate that impact is really critical. So while we have these incredible updates on the work that we've done over this last year, we are in the process of utilizing anti-racist results-based accountability to develop and operationalize our racial equity action plans for all 21 citywide departments. We already have strategies, but we need to build and add metrics to that work. So these strategies will be specific and measurable and guarantee that we can monitor and evaluate our impact in the years to come. So as Teresa mentioned, Long Beach is a proud member of the GARE network. And as such, we were introduced to the Racial Equity Action Planning and our incredible consultants that have helped us navigate this process over the last year. So to quickly walk you through the process, we begin at the top of this inverted triangle, and we're looking at the results. Our result statement here in Long Beach is that all people in Long Beach are healthy, safe, and thriving. Next, we use population level indicators such as low income, extreme rent burden, and life expectancy to help us measure whether we are meeting this vision. Our racial equity champions are currently at the root cause analysis step, where we repeatedly ask each other why and not how. And then from this analysis, we identify the hot roots, the things that each city department can seek to change, connecting back to the findings of reconciliation, so that we are able to design strategies with built-in accountability measures that each department can prioritize to evaluate our impact. So just to quickly show you some of the data for what this looks like in Long Beach, we've taken all of our population level indicators and disaggregated that information by both race and place using zip codes and racial and ethnic demographic data. Low income or poverty at 200% of the federal poverty level in Long Beach is also a measure of working poor. So for a family of 4 in the city of Long Beach, this equates to $53,000 a year. In 2017, 21% of the Latinx people in our community were considered low income, followed by people of color as a whole, and that was at 16%. With Black and Asian Pacific Islanders at 9%, in contrast to white people in Long Beach, which is 4%. Next, our second indicator is severe rent burden, which disproportionately impacts Black people at 34%. However, if you are looking at this table, you can see that many other groups within Long Beach are strongly impacted by high rents and incomes that don't match the high cost of living in Long Beach. And then finally, our last population level indicator is life expectancy, which is a measure of how long a baby born in Long Beach can expect to live. So in Long Beach, we see that year over year, the average gap between Black people and white people is about 8 years. Historically, our data also shows that there's a 17-year gap in life expectancy from one side of the city to the other. So we know that these disparities have been further exacerbated throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's really important that we keep this in mind as we build in metrics to those racial equity strategies each department uplifts. All right. So again, we are currently at this step within the results-based accountability methodology, and that is understanding the root causes, facilitating root cause analysis. So we actually paused at this. I saw a few questions in the chat about how much time you should spend on this. And when we initially brought on consultants to help us create racial equity action plans, we thought we could get this done in 6 months. Why? Because we already had reconciliation. We have internal staffing infrastructure dedicated to it. But I will speak to some of the challenges we've encountered throughout this process later on in the presentation. So what I'll do here is just kind of briefly explain root cause analysis and then contextualize where we've left off. So throughout the root cause analysis step, we begin with a specific population level indicator, and we are repeatedly asking ourselves why. Why is there a gap for Black people and people of color in the city? Why do we have this disproportionality? And what city policies and practices are preserving this inequity? So we asked this at least 5 to 10 times. I believe Leslie had mentioned asking why at least 5 to 7 times. And we do this to really ensure that we're moving past the superficial sources of racial inequity. And as we do that, we are moving again from superficial sources to naming the qualitative elements, such as opinions and narratives that perpetuate these outcomes. We also named the structural and institutional elements, such as the policies and practices that create this, the inequities that we're analyzing. And then finally, we name the history, the belief systems, the cultural assumptions that create and maintain inequities for Black people and people of color. So next step is really the performance accountability process. This is having identified the root causes most relevant and salient to each department's scope of work, and then creating strategies and measures to determine whether communities of color are better off as a result. Our strategy development involves connecting back to reconciliation, identifying the partnering organizations, the resources, timing components, and deliverables associated with each objective. And then again, making sure that each strategy is race explicit. All right. Passing it back to Teresa.
Alana. So we're being asked to wrap it up a little bit. We had just a few slides left that focus on promising practices, challenges, and next steps, but we can share those slides with you all. And that, we'd be happy to discuss it further if there's any questions that come up, but I'll turn it back over to Anika because she, or maybe we wanted to answer some questions or wait till after Portland has gone. But we want to thank you for your time this afternoon and thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. I saw a couple of questions come into the chat. I do know that we're a little bit short on time. So if you guys would feel comfortable answering those directly in the chat. I saw one come in asking how often do the work groups meet, and ask about the internal membership of those work groups. And then also if that report has been amended, the reconciliation report. And finally, I just saw a question here from Stephen. How do you implement change successfully if you face leadership roadblocks? So if you both want to address those questions directly in the chat, that would be fantastic. And for now, I will turn it over to our next presenters from the City of Portland. So Daniel Brooks works at the City of Portland's Equity and Civil Rights, Title VI Manager in the Office of Equity and Human Rights. Dana's work focuses on how the city serves the public, impacts the public, and progresses towards achieving just and equitable outcomes. And Sveta Ambati works as Equitable Development Analyst for the City of Portland. She collaborates with city bureaus and external stakeholders on embedding equity into the development process. So welcome, Danielle and Sveta. And I think they will also be sharing their slides if you want to launch those as well, and we'll get those up on the screen.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Anika. Hi, everyone. My name is Sveta Ambati, she, her pronouns. Just going to share my screen really quick. Just let me know if you don't see these slides. All right. Okay, well, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I know we're kind of short on time, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive directly into our presentation. But just to give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today, we'll be starting with the history of racial equity plans at the City of Portland, some thoughts on that past process that started back in 2015, how we're introducing accountability, and I'll probably be repeating a little bit of what was said earlier about RBA and using results-based accountability in our new approach. And I'll pass it off to Danielle Brooks, my colleague at the Office of Equity and Human Rights, who will be talking a little bit more about the relationship of our work to some of the concurrent efforts across the city. And then hopefully at the end of our presentation, we'll have some time for questions and comments as needed. So jumping right into that brief history. So back in July of 2015, Portland City Council had adopted citywide racial equity goals and strategies as binding city policy. And what this led to was that the Office of Equity published a guide to let bureaus know how to create their own individual 5-year racial equity plans. And by the end of that year, at the end of 2016, most bureaus published their individual 5-year racial equity plans. And they look like this. Apologies for the super tiny font. Please do not strain your eyes trying to read this. I will explain it verbally, but it's a spreadsheet. Starts with goals, long-term goals for each bureau to list some of the 5-year bureau objectives. So kind of dividing those goals into smaller bite-sized pieces. Thinking about strategies and bureau actions that help contribute to that goal or bureau objective. And then we had initially asked each bureau to submit on an annual basis a performance measure that will help the Office of Equity understand where, in the progress each individual bureau is in terms of achieving that long-term goal or that bureau objective. So back in 2016, City Council adopted another resolution titled City's Equity Budget Tool and Racial Equity Plans. This is the resolution that actually mandated racial equity plans across the city. So if a bureau had not submitted a racial equity plan so far, they had to at this point. And in 2017 and 2018, some bureaus, keyword there, only some, not all, submitted their year 1 and year 2 racial equity plan update. So that annual performance measure that we had initially asked every bureau to submit on an annual basis. And then fast forward to 2020, City Council adopted a resolution to recommend the use of results-based accountability, or RBA, in strategies and budget guidance to address the COVID-19 crisis. And I'll go into a little bit more about why that was important and led to this new updated racial equity plan process. And then by mid-2021, 2022, most bureaus' racial equity plans from that 2015 round actually expired or will be expiring soon. So why update the racial equity plan process? We really wanted to think about and ask these questions of our stakeholders. First is what was working, what wasn't working, who knew about these plans, did they actually help advance racial equity, who had been regularly updating their racial equity plan process, and how did each bureau feel about their racial equity plans. And so we also wanted to have a little bit of external engagement and asked a few community members how they felt about the city's racial equity plans as well. So this is some of the negative feedback that we received from equity managers and equity practitioners. In the city of Portland, there is a title and position for equity managers. Usually every bureau tends to have at least one equity manager. However, some bureaus don't have equity managers, and therefore there's someone with a different title who acts in the capacity of contributing towards racial equity plans or their mandated equity efforts. So it's a group of about 20 to 25 people across the city. And most folks did mention that there was a huge disconnect between racial equity plans and department strategic plans, that the plans themselves, because they're created on the individual bureau by bureau basis, tended to actually reinforce existing silos. There was not much accountability. The plans did not feel very leverageable. The metrics that were chosen for that performance measure on an annual basis were not really consistently collected or sustainable to report on over time. Some bureaus felt like this racial equity plan process was a one-time requirement. There was no standardized way to track progress towards goals. And I kept this next statement word for word because I felt like it was very poignant, but someone mentioned that it felt like superficial allyship since no one knows if plans actually resulted in more racial equity. Across the board, everyone did mention that this work needs to happen in conjunction with culture change to be truly effective. So not everything we heard was negative. There was some positives. One is that there was some cross-bureau collaboration that was in this process of creating racial equity plans. And that was really great for people. It did provide dedicated time and resources towards racial equity. For some bureaus, previous leadership was very supportive of this whole process, and it did help implement equity into strategic plans when applicable. When we did meet with the community-based organizations, we heard that, not surprising, but no one really knew the city of Portland had racial equity plans. They seemed really inaccessible. They were not publicly available. A lot of folks were unsure of how racial equity plans would tie into work being done by their organizations. But most folks also mentioned that they would be interested in a public-facing dashboard or platform to track progress towards outcomes identified in racial equity plans. So in a sense, they're also asking for a little bit more of that accountability. So as a result, we decided to introduce 3 methods of accountability for this new updated racial equity plan process. The first is using results-based accountability, or RBA, as I'll refer to it in this presentation, to select equitable outcomes and indicators. The second is to embed racial equity in the budget approval process, so ensuring that all of the work that's being done to advance racial equity is adequately resourced over time. And the third is presenting racial equity plans to City Council and requesting commissioner approval. So really lifting this work up into the public eye and making sure there's some more political will and support behind it over time. So before I move on to RBA, which is what I'll spend most of this presentation on, just a quick reminder on what is accountability. So accountability is taking responsibility to create the results expected from our communities. It's requiring transparency, integrity, and humility to acknowledge disproportionate impacts. It's building trust by shifting the focus from performance to impact on equitable outcomes. And then what accountability is not, is it's not a punitive process. So this whole thing is not meant to be a punishment for bureaus, but really kind of lifting up that work and making it more transparent. So that first method of accountability, which is using the results-based accountability framework, I know our previous presenters also kind of mentioned this. I won't spend too much time on this, but I did actually want to ask how many folks had actually heard of RBA prior to this session. Just give me like a thumbs up or a high five or something as a reaction, or drop a line in the comments. I know you have, Danielle. Okay. Great, so some folks have. I won't spend too much time on exactly what RBA is, but I did want to provide a little bit of insight into how we're applying it in the city of Portland. Really trying to frame our racial equity plans in a way that directly connects programs, policies, and services or actions to equitable outcomes identified by each bureau. We also really want to use data to support accountability towards those equitable outcomes and to transparently share information about the performance of programs, policies, and services that are intended to advance racial equity. And then going through that amazing root cause analysis exercise to really identify the root causes of our issues and disparities in the city. So our consultants had put this slide together, but these are the 7 questions of population accountability on the left-hand side. So these are the kind of the questions you want to ask yourselves as you come up with that result statement. I love that second question, but the first one is, what condition of well-being do we want for our community? So what are the results we want to see? And then what would these conditions look like, feel like, or taste like if we achieve them? So really making that result statement more tangible. And then what measures can we use to actually quantify that condition of well-being? So what would be an indicator that would help us understand how we're doing? And what are some of the disparities that data shows us over time? And then keep asking ourselves why? Just like everyone said 5 to 10 times, to really understand why that disparity exists. What are the root causes of our issues? And then developing strategies around that. And on the right-hand side, there's 7 questions of performance accountability. So this is kind of how we shift away from the population impact to what can we do within our bureaus and our government structures to actually advance and work towards that condition of well-being that we've identified. So identifying who's better off from our programs, policies, and services, and how we can measure that over time, what it really takes to turn the curve for the indicator that we identify on the left-hand side. And then, so this is another graphic kind of displaying how we start with that result or a condition of well-being for all people, and then we work backwards. I'm gonna, in the city of Portland, we are taking a step back from doing this at the citywide level. And so we're really kind of thinking about how we want to approach this on the bureau specific level. So I'm just gonna pretend for a moment that I'm the Bureau of Transportation in Portland, which is PBOT. PBOT, a result statement they could think about would be all people in Portland can move easily and safely around the city to meet their daily needs. And then they'd kind of work backwards, think about what are the indicators or data sources that can be used to help us identify how we're doing in that condition of well-being. And so an indicator could potentially be commute times segregated by race, ethnicity throughout the city of Portland. And then, the indicator statement or the data source could show us that people of color, low-income households have longer, more strenuous commutes in the city of Portland. And so we think about asking ourselves why, at least 5 to 10 times. So why does that happen? Until we get to a strategy that can help us identify how we can actually turn the curve for that indicator. So how do we improve that impact on low-income households and people of color in Portland? And then we think about the performance level, which is the programs, policies, and services that would actually help us move the needle for that indicator. And then the better off measures, so the actual data points or performance measures for each of those programs, policies, and services over time. It's kind of a RBA in a snapshot. Another just brief point before I hand it off to Danielle, moving from goals to outcomes. We have a lot of goal setting in the city of Portland, and sometimes it feels kind of nebulous. And here's an example from a past racial equity plan. I know I'm throwing our Bureau of Development Services under the bus here a little bit, but they had an example goal from their last racial equity plan, which is that BDS is a regional and national leader in the government's efforts to eliminate structural racism. On surface level, sounds like a really, really great goal to have, and the intention is there. But when we think about what that actually feels like, looks like, tastes like for the people in Portland, it's not quite so clear. So we're really encouraging our bureaus to move away from establishing these larger picture goals to actually really thinking about tangible experiences and changes for people in Portland and for our most vulnerable populations. And the same goes for metrics. So we're trying to think about, instead of picking metrics like this one, same example for this goal, BDS had actually chosen metric to report on an annual basis what percentage of managers actually participated in racial equity training, which is great. I think it's a really great performance measure. At the end of the day, though, is it actually telling us who's benefiting and who's better off and whether this has a good impact on the population in Portland? Not so much. So that's why we're really focusing on results and indicators and using RBA and moving away from these larger goal setting exercises. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Danielle to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Swetha. Hi, everyone. I will try and get through this as quickly as possible. I know we're not left with a lot of time. I'll just note that as we've shifted to this different approach, our bureaus have faced a lot of challenges in creating equity outcomes. So even when we're working at the population level, there can be different degrees of scope or specificity. And we have asked our bureaus to develop their own population level equity outcomes in addition to this kind of citywide perspective. We felt it was important for them to go through the process and identify and consider what conditions of well-being they most impact or are most relevant to their work. This isn't to say that we're not addressing cross-bureau work or we're not working from a cohesive vision or foundation, but rather engaging bureaus in this approach to framing creates buy-in and enhanced accountability in their action planning at all different levels of the organization. So at this stage, it also allows for a degree of focused attention. In a concurrent project, we are refining citywide equity outcomes based on existing city plans, policies, foundational equity frameworks, and our recent community planning efforts. And we intend for these different levels to merge, inform, and align with each other, but we didn't only want the citywide perspective leading the work. So bureaus have found it really challenging sometimes to balance between outcomes that are too broad and too narrow. So keeping with our Bureau of Development Services example, they originally went really broad, like all people in Portland are safe. And this can be fine for a region or city, but it makes the following steps of actually going through root cause analysis and identifying particular strategies to turn the curve a little bit more difficult and a little bit too broad. They kind of ended up having a lot of scope creep and lacked the accountability. Conversely, bureaus also moved towards outcomes that were too narrow, and they ended up trending into the performative or really focusing on identifying strategies and actions as their outcomes, and those aren't really population level outcomes. So it was important for them to find that sweet spot. For our Bureau of Development Services, it could look something like all people in Portland live in safe, quality, affordable homes and neighborhoods of their choice. We also found that bureaus were having difficulty, again, falling back to goals instead of focusing on actual population level outcomes. And it's not to say that those goals and processes like engagement or hiring won't end up being incorporated into the actions and strategies, but it ends up centering the work more on the organizational function instead of if people and communities are really better off. So next slide, please. And so for the sake of time, I'll just note that the anti-racist RBA process has really helped us address some issues from the previous plan, like lack of standardization, accountability, and really unsuitable metrics. So others have really shared this approach, so I won't go too into it. I'll just say that the root cause analysis has allowed us to select indicators that really track progress towards real equitable outcomes. And then having bureaus ask what it would take to turn the curve really helps focus attention on creating really better off performance measures. And we're selecting metrics that are sustainable and consistently collected over time, disaggregated, and we are using existing resources where we can to really help support this kind of culture of data sharing across the organization. And to the right, you will see kind of the process that was created by the firm Clear Impact on how you can use the RBA process to turn the curve. Next slide, please. So at a central or citywide level, one thing we hope to achieve or create from the Bureau racial equity plans is a process map detailing each bureau's equity outcomes, the policies, programs, and services that contributed to those outcomes, and how each program is being measured. This way we can align and merge our work at the citywide level and then see the bird's eye view of how each bureau or different program and service across the city collaborate, may work on strategies together, and contribute to these larger citywide outcomes. This again supports that need for a more cohesive vision, unity, and kind of de-siloing of the work. We think this is a really important first step to make the work more digestible for the public and also for ourselves at a citywide scale. It helps us pull together our work. Instead of having bureaus only have a discrete plan, we can actually see how different bureaus' work contributes to impact the same outcome. This also makes sure that we're not reinventing the wheel as well when it comes to measuring progress. So it kind of gives us a citywide map and a citywide progress map overall. Next slide, please. So this is our sample template for the racial equity plans in our internal reporting. You'll note that it's similar to the template from the last plans, but the major difference is that it's designed with RBA in mind. So it starts with the outcomes and works backwards towards the specific policies, programs, and services that may contribute to those equitable outcomes. Our bureaus will include performance measures that they developed using root cause analysis, and these will include quantity, quality, and better off metrics. We're asking bureaus for clarity on the frequency for how often the data will be updated, to identify lead staff, and to identify both internal and external partners in the work or in the strategies. So this structure and overall approach allows us to be more flexible based on what we learn over time. It kind of changes our outlook from being reactionary to proactive, and we can update these plans on an ongoing basis. With the structure, we're open to change, so we can add additions to plans, be more responsive to shifting priorities and conditions, and it moves us away from a 5-year timeline. So we can always be adding strategies or different actions as we move forward. And this back-end data collection format allows for more consistent monitoring and easier reporting. We're really lucky. We've actually already been using this structure and reporting for our city's American Rescue Plan, LFRM planning and delivery. And so we've already seen this kind of template and this work in action, and it's been really helping us organize that work as well as we look to how we're using rescue plan dollars towards moving towards equitable outcomes. So we're actually already have a foundation for a lot of this kind of process in this format. Overall, our office's role has been to engage and get feedback from stakeholders, develop the new approach, support bureaus through the process, and lead on the citywide work. So we've developed the guide, created the template. We're working on citywide outcomes and indicators, and we also have been offering like office hours, support sessions, and are providing a 10-session cohort developed in partnership with the firm Equity and Results to provide coaching to the application of RBA and equity plan development. Right now, our bureaus have identified their equity outcomes and are finishing up their root cause analysis and are starting to move into that strategy and action phase. So in that turning the curve phase. So they've kind of started, we start with the first couple columns and we're moving into those middle columns here. Our cohort is actually near the end, but over the next year, bureaus will continue to develop and refine their strategies, actions, and performance measures. Our office will develop the process map and continue with the citywide work. We'll start to have cluster sessions to identify and develop cross-bureau strategies and actions, and then we'll submit to council for acceptance, which again introduces more political will and provides with another opportunity for community engagement. So we want to build out this, after this, a public-facing data visualization tool like a dashboard or story maps, which we can provide baseline equity data on relevant social conditions and in an ongoing basis, and communicate and share our progress and our work. So we enhance that transparency as well. Next slide, please. Finally, we want to be efficient in how we collect data and share information. So there are multiple efforts that are reporting outcomes and metrics across the city, and we are working collaboratively to make sure the data is standardized and then we're not replicating at different timelines or different scales of reports. And we think this is a really important process to embedding equity across the entire organization. So because the plan is structured in the way that it is, allows for easier integration as opposed to maybe a longer, like 50-page document. So as I said before, we're working on the equity outcomes and indicators. We've identified opportunities for strategic plans to include the outcomes and metrics that we're working on to measure progress, or vice versa, implementing outcomes and metrics in strategic plans. It's also time for us to update our citywide and bureau Title VI plans and subsequent progress reports. So we're using a phased approach that actually incorporates Title VI plans into racial equity plans. We couldn't do this in the past because the old plans lacked measurement and evidence of how we were serving and impacting community and addressing disparities or meeting community needs. So it was kind of public conditions and abstraction. But because we're formatting it this way, we can actually use it and have different chapters. And the Title VI reporting can address some of those elements of how we develop, use, and the effectiveness of our equity tools and practices. Because, as I said before, we're using a similar format that was intentionally built into the American Rescue Plan delivery. So we can use standardized metrics and outcomes from the ARPA reports and the racial equity plans together. And we can also build off that infrastructure as well. We're using the resources and metrics identified in our affirmative action plans to inform and track progress. And finally, we're embedding racial equity plans in our budget process through review of budget asks that relate to advancing equity plan outcomes. So we're building that into our already existing budget equity tool. Next slide. So sorry, that was really quick. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you sharing your time with us today. And I know we're running towards the end.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I know we only have a couple minutes left today, but we do want to ask you both of the City of Portland and the City of Long Beach one very quick question to help us wrap up for today. In less than 1 minute, if you can, what is one tip you have for jurisdictions that are just getting started in this work? Maybe if we want to start with either Danielle or Smita, and maybe we can have one person from each city.
Yeah, I feel like one tip that has been really great for us to focus on right now is like when and where do we kind of get the political support for this work? Because we can put a lot of time and effort into this, but at the end of the day, if the report gets shelved, if it gets dropped, like it's kind of out of our control for it to actually move towards those impacts that we really want it to do. And so making sure that we have the conversations with our elected officials, with people in the community, to make sure that we involve everyone throughout the process so that, you know, there's more eyes on it and that we can actually really get it moving and keep it accountable over time would be the, I guess, the biggest tip I have.
I could go.
It does. Go ahead.
Let's see. Well, there's many things. I agree with Portland for sure. The political will is really important. Internal transformation, I would say getting the executive leadership on board so that the folks that are on the ground doing the work have the support at every level. That's something that we're really, really focused on in year 2 is engaging our top leadership. They were engaged in the beginning, but definitely engaging them even more so. Starting from basic capacity building and training for everybody, and then going from there. And so we're really developing and building out our curriculum so that we can fully engage them and that our champions feel like it's not performative, but it's getting embedded into their work. It's getting embedded into strategic plans. We're working on a strategic vision for the city. So we're working it in through all the different strategic plans that it comes to fruition through our strategic vision. So getting everybody on the same page. That's in simple terms.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today at today's Toolbox Tuesday training. Just to note, it is at the end of our time today. I'm going to quick wrap up with just a couple of announcements, but we deeply appreciate your engagement. Jennifer, if you don't mind just launching our last couple of slides, that would be great. I'll go through these very quickly, but as we wrap up today, I just want to highlight a quick resource that SCAG recently developed, the Equity Resource Guide. We've heard a lot of requests from local jurisdictions that are interested in taking on this equity work, but not sure where to start. This resource guide includes a variety of local, state, and national examples of equity efforts. And we welcome your use and review of this resource. And feel free to reach out to us if you have other examples that you'd like to see included in the future. I'll have a link to that in the chat. Thank you. And then we also like to invite you to join us at our next Equity Working Group meeting this June. We are planning to talk about the California's Healthy Places Index 3.0 and equity performance metrics at this upcoming meeting. And we welcome you to join us and register and to learn more about the link also placed in the chat. We have next on this slide here, we just had a quick question of what equity focused Toolbox trainings would be most useful to you. If you are able to answer, I'm going to only give us about 15 seconds since we are over time right now. If not, we'll just maybe jump on to the next slide. Yes, thank you all for joining us today. I see a couple of people are headed out, but I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to share what we have so far. It's kind of a mixed bag. And we'll think about that as we look forward to creating our next equity-focused Toolbox Tuesday. As you can see, we have a mix of responses, and we'll definitely keep that in mind as we plan our next equity-focused Toolbox Tuesday. And then finally here, we just have a quick 2-minute survey. We'll send out that link following today's presentation. So you can do it now, or you can do it at a later time, but we really welcome and we'll look forward to hearing your feedback on how today's presentation and this workshop went. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, presenters, and we look forward to seeing you next time.